Just after midnight this past Thursday, the ground moved 3 times in quick succession beneath a small stretch of farmland south of Brawley, California. A magnitude 3.1. Then, 15 minutes later, a 3.6, the strongest of the sequence. Then, just before 2 a.m., a third jolt at magnitude 3.4. On paper, none of those numbers sound dramatic. But the location is what makes seismologists sit up and pay attention every single time this patch of desert starts shaking, because this is the Brawley Seismic Zone, the exact stretch of fractured, restless crust that connects the northern end of the Imperial Fault to the southern tip of the San Andreas Fault, the fault system California's entire earthquake safety culture is built around. This region has a well-documented history of exactly this kind of activity escalating, sometimes staying small, sometimes not. So today we're breaking down what actually happened this week, what the Brawley Seismic Zone is, and why it matters so much to the bigger San Andreas picture, what scientists specifically watch for when a sequence like this begins, and what the real current science says about the odds of this turning into something larger. No fear-mongering, no "the big one is imminent" clickbait. Just the seismology, the history, and the honest odds. If breakdowns like this help you actually understand what's happening instead of just scrolling past another alarming headline, this is exactly the channel to have in your feed. Because seismic activity like this deserves careful explanation, not panic. Drop a comment and tell me if you felt anything from this sequence, especially if you're anywhere in Imperial County, the Coachella Valley, or Mexicali, because I want to hear what it actually felt like on the ground. And if you want the next update, the second new activity is reported, subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get into it. According to the United States Geological Survey, the sequence began just after midnight local time, with the first quake, magnitude 3.1, striking about 7 kilometers south of Brawley at a depth of roughly 10.5 kilometers. The second and strongest event, a magnitude 3.6, followed about 15 minutes later at essentially the same location, just slightly deeper. A third quake, magnitude 3.4, rounded out the immediate sequence just before 2 a.m. The shaking was reported felt across Brawley itself, as well as the nearby communities of Holtville and Heber, and even reached across the border into parts of Mexico. More than 36 people submitted felt reports to the USGS's citizen science reporting tool in the hours afterward. No injuries, no structural damage, and USGS characterized the shaking produced as weak, which is entirely typical for earthquakes in this magnitude range. On its own, a handful of magnitude 3 range quakes wouldn't normally justify a dedicated video. Small earthquakes happen across California constantly, and this region in particular is no stranger to them. But the reason this specific cluster is worth understanding goes well beyond the individual magnitudes, and it has everything to do with exactly where these quakes are happening. The Brawley Seismic Zone sits in the Salton Trough of Southern California, a geologically unusual stretch where the plate boundary transitions from the strike-slip motion of the San Andreas Fault to the strike-slip motion of the Imperial Fault, through a messier zone of smaller, less clearly mapped faults rather than one single clean fault line. Geologists sometimes describe this kind of transition zone as tectonically leaky, meaning the crust here is thinner, weaker, and riddled with smaller fractures compared to the more rigid fault segments on either side of it. That structural weakness is exactly why this specific patch of desert produces earthquake swarms so much more frequently than most other parts of California. There's also a geothermal dimension to this that's worth understanding, because it's part of why USGS researchers specifically study this zone for what they call potentially induced seismicity. The area sits directly on top of active geothermal fields, including the North Brawley geothermal field and the Salton Sea geothermal field, where companies extract and inject fluids deep underground as part of geothermal energy production. Research from USGS scientists has examined whether these fluid extraction and injection processes might be altering earthquake rates in this specific zone, similar to how wastewater injection has been linked to increased seismicity in parts of Oklahoma and Arkansas. The honest answer from that research is nuanced. Natural fluid movement deep underground, whether from geothermal processes or simply groundwater shifting through fractured rock, appears capable of lubricating and stressing these small faults independent of any human activity. And the Brawley Zone has been producing swarms like this for as long as modern seismic monitoring has existed here, well before large-scale geothermal energy production began. So while researchers continue studying the geothermal question carefully, the swarms themselves are considered a fundamentally natural feature of this particular stretch of crust. This is a good moment to explain a distinction that seismologists care about deeply, because it directly shapes how concerning a sequence like this actually is. Most earthquake activity people are familiar with follows what's called a main shock-aftershock pattern. One large earthquake strikes, and then a predictable decaying sequence of smaller aftershocks follows, gradually tapering off according to well-established statistical patterns that seismologists can model with real confidence. A swarm is different, and in some ways harder to interpret. In a swarm, there's no single dominant main shock. Instead, you get a cluster of earthquakes of broadly similar size, occurring close together in time and space, without one obviously larger event driving the sequence. Because there's no clear main shock, swarms don't necessarily decay the way a standard aftershock sequence would, and that unpredictability is exactly why scientists watch them so closely, even when individual magnitudes stay modest. This week's 3-quake cluster near Brawley is small enough that it may simply fade out entirely within days, which is what happens to the overwhelming majority of activity in this zone. But the Brawley seismic zone's specific history is what keeps seismologists from dismissing any new activity here out of hand. This exact patch of ground has produced escalating swarms before, more than once. In 1981, a swarm beginning near the town of Westmoreland escalated into a magnitude 5.8 earthquake. In 2012, a swarm in the Brawley area itself climbed to a magnitude 5.5 main shock that evacuated buildings, shattered windows, knocked mobile homes off their foundations, and briefly forced a local hospital to evacuate. A swarm beginning in September of 2020 near Westmoreland produced dozens of magnitude 3+ events, topping out at magnitude 4.9, before gradually stabilizing over about a week. Even the swarm this past May, one of the more recent large sequences in this zone, produced more than 0 recorded earthquakes over a single weekend, including a peak of magnitude 4.7. Notice the pattern here. These sequences typically begin small, sometimes with quakes barely large enough to notice, and only some of them go on to escalate into something that actually causes damage. According to USGS's own historical statistics for this zone, past swarms have lasted anywhere from 1 day to 20 days, with about a week being typical. That range itself tells you something important. At the very outset of a new sequence, even experienced seismologists genuinely cannot tell you with confidence whether you're looking at a swarm that fizzles out within 48 hours or one that's building towards something considerably larger. Because the Brawley seismic zone directly links the Imperial Fault to the southern terminus of the San Andreas, the question that comes up every single time this area starts shaking is whether activity here could trigger something on the San Andreas itself. It's a fair question, and seismologists take it seriously enough to study specifically. But the honest answer, based on decades of monitoring this exact scenario, is that the probability remains low, even though it isn't 0. Here's why that matters and how scientists actually quantify it rather than just reassuring the public with vague language. USGS has previously calculated, during past Brawley area swarms, that the chance of a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake being triggered on the southern San Andreas Fault temporarily rises during active swarm periods, sometimes to roughly a 1 in 100 chance over the following week, compared to a typical baseline of somewhere around 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000 in an average week. That's a real measurable increase, sometimes framed as the risk being tens to hundreds of times higher than normal during an active swarm. But look at those numbers again. Even at their most elevated during a much larger, more energetic swarm than the modest 3-quake sequence recorded this week, we are still talking about a low single-digit percentage chance. Not a coin flip, and definitely not a near certainty. This is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost in more sensationalized coverage of these events, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Scientists aren't dismissing the San Andreas connection. They're actively studying it, calculating real probabilities from historical data every time a swarm occurs here, and communicating those numbers honestly rather than either downplaying the risk entirely or inflating it into imminent catastrophe. It's worth understanding why any activity near this particular fault junction gets extra scrutiny, independent of this week's specific quakes. The southernmost section of the San Andreas Fault has not produced a major rupture since the Fort Tejon earthquake of January 1857, an estimated magnitude 7.9 event. That's over a century and a half of the Pacific and North American plates grinding past each other at a steady rate of roughly 2 inches per year, without that particular fault segment releasing a major rupture. All of that accumulated motion has to go somewhere. And the working assumption among seismologists is that it's being stored as elastic stress in the surrounding rock, exactly the mechanism that eventually produces a large earthquake, once the stress finally exceeds what the locked fault section can hold. Some researchers describe the southern San Andreas as essentially loaded and waiting, a description that sounds dramatic, but is really just a description of ordinary fault mechanics playing out over an unusually long, quiet stretch. A widely cited estimate from the Southern California Earthquake Center put the odds of a magnitude 7.0 or larger earthquake striking this general region at around 75%, sometime over multiple decades, a number that reflects the long-term inevitability of a major rupture on California's fault systems generally, not a specific prediction tied to this week's quakes or any particular swarm. There's also an interesting wrinkle that some researchers have proposed, that the shrinking of the nearby Salton Sea itself may be subtly influencing the timing of stress buildup in this exact region, since the changing weight of water sitting on top of the crust can, in theory, affect the pressure on faults underneath it. This remains an active area of research rather than settled science, but it's one more example of just how many variables scientists are tracking simultaneously in this one specific corner of California. So, concretely, what does the monitoring process look like in the days immediately following a sequence like this week's? First, and most basically, rate and magnitude trend. Seismologists watch whether the frequency of quakes in the area is increasing, holding steady, or already declining, and whether new events are trending larger or smaller than the initial cluster. A sequence that's already tapering off within the first day or two, which appears to be the case with this week's Brawley activity so far, is treated very differently than one where magnitudes keep climbing. Second, spatial migration. Researchers track whether the earthquakes are staying tightly clustered in one small area or gradually spreading outward along the fault system, since a swarm that migrates toward either the Imperial Fault or the San Andreas itself would be a meaningfully different situation than one that stays contained within the Brawley zone's typical boundaries. Third, depth and mechanism. Seismologists look at whether new events are occurring at consistent depths and with similar fault slip characteristics to the initial quakes, which would suggest continued activity on the same structure, versus a shift in depth or mechanism that might indicate stress transferring onto a different adjacent fault. And fourth, and this is the part that rarely gets explained clearly in more sensational coverage, USGS runs statistical aftershock and swarm forecasting models continuously in the background of any notable sequence, updating the probability of a larger earthquake in the following days as new data comes in. These aren't guesses. They're built from the specific historical statistics of this exact zone, calibrated against every documented swarm going back decades, which is exactly how researchers arrive at those specific percentage estimates, rather than just offering a general reassurance. It's worth mentioning here that California's earthquake early warning infrastructure has specifically been built with scenarios like this in mind. The statewide Shake Alert system, accessible to the public through the MyShake app and integrated into many phones automatically, is designed to detect the first, faster-traveling seismic waves from a quake and push out an alert before the slower, more damaging shaking waves arrive. During earlier, larger Brawley area swarms, including the sequence this past May, Shake Alert has already demonstrated its ability to issue warnings to residents in the moments before stronger shaking hit. That system doesn't reduce the underlying seismic risk in this zone, but it does mean that if any future sequence here does escalate significantly, the region and the broader Southern California population downstream of it have meaningfully more warning infrastructure in place than in past decades. If you're in Imperial County, the Coachella Valley, or anywhere in the broader Southern California region that pays attention to San Andreas activity, here's the grounded, practical version of everything above. This week's specific sequence, 3 moderate quakes with no damage and rapidly weakening intensity reported afterward, does not currently represent an elevated, scientifically flagged risk period the way some past, much larger Brawley swarms have. There's no current state or USGS advisory tied to this particular cluster. That said, living anywhere near California's major fault systems means earthquake preparedness should be a background constant, not something you scramble to address only when a swarm makes headlines. Practically, that means having your household's basic emergency supplies in order: water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, flashlights, and any needed medications, enough to comfortably last at least a week without needing to restock. It means knowing the drop, cover, and hold on response well enough that it's automatic rather than something you have to think through in the moment. It means securing heavy furniture, water heaters, and anything that could fall or become a hazard during strong shaking. And it means having the MyShake app installed and Shake Alert notifications enabled on your phone, since those seconds of warning genuinely matter for getting into a safer position before the strongest shaking arrives. Here's what I think is actually the most useful takeaway from a story like this one. A cluster of magnitude 3 range earthquakes near Brawley is, on its own, a genuinely minor event. It caused no damage, injured no one, and by most historical comparisons, in this exact zone, may simply fade out within days without escalating further. But the reason seismologists don't shrug off even minor activity here is that this specific stretch of ground has, more than once, turned a quiet cluster of small quakes into a damaging magnitude 5+ event within the same week, and it sits at the literal junction connecting to one of the most closely studied, most overdue major fault segments in North America. That combination, historically documented escalation potential plus geological proximity to enormous long-term risk, is exactly why a story that would be a one-line footnote almost anywhere else in the country becomes something Southern California seismologists watch closely every single time it happens here. It's not panic, it's pattern recognition built from decades of exactly this kind of activity being carefully tracked, logged, and studied. Based on the historical pattern for sequences in this zone, the most likely outcome, by a wide margin, is that this week's activity continues to decay over the coming days and eventually stops being newsworthy at all, the same outcome as the majority of past Brawley area swarms. USGS will continue monitoring the rate and location of any additional events. And if the sequence does show signs of escalating, meaning larger magnitudes, an increasing rate of events, or migration toward either the Imperial Fault or the San Andreas itself, that's exactly the kind of development that would justify a formal advisory and a follow-up video breaking down what changed and why. We'll be watching the USGS feed for this region closely over the coming days, and we'll have an update if anything meaningfully changes. If you want that update the moment new activity is reported, instead of finding out secondhand, subscribing and turning on notifications is the best way to stay ahead of it. Before you go, drop a comment and let me know if you felt any of this week's shaking, or if you've ever experienced a Brawley area swarm before, since this region has been producing these clusters for decades, and I know a lot of you have your own stories from past ones. And if this breakdown helped you actually understand the science instead of just reacting to another alarming headline about the San Andreas, a like helps this reach the people who need a clear, honest explanation instead of a panicked one. Stay prepared, keep your Shake Alert notifications on, and I'll see you in the next one.